Hello, scales and more. Now, let me start by saying something general, more or less preliminary as well. Those who use the notion of scale quite frequently or intensively very often articulate extreme discomfort about it. So they feel ambivalent about it, in the sense that on the one hand, of course, it's a notion that is productive, but at the same time limited. So there are limitations to its productivity and the way in which it can work in analysis. Another thing is, many of these people feel that it is, yes, indispensable, but not precise enough. It lacks accuracy, it lacks determination, and so on and so on. And of course, same here. I've been using that notion for a while now, and there is, of course, an inherent ambivalence about it, in the sense that the metaphor, the notion of scales, implies two dimensions, one horizontal, the other one, let's say, vertical. The horizontal one is the meaning we attribute to the notion of scale, in the sense of scope, dimension, degree, and so on and so on. So this has to do with the spread, the magnitude of a particular phenomenon. The second dimension is a scale is a thing, that we use to weigh stuff, and in that sense, it has a distinction of quality. So here we see that scale is attributed, or at least has these attributions of value, of distinction, of stratification, of hierarchy. So in other words, whereas the first dimension is horizontal and emphasizes equivalence in a way, the other one basically emphasizes the opposite. It has to do with value distinctions, i.e. with inequality, with stratification, with hierarchy. These two things, are always there. Whenever we use the notion of scales, we will hit this particular ambivalence. There's very little we can do about it. So the point that I'm going to try to make is, while trying to basically tell the story of my own use of that notion of scales, I'm going to try to emphasize essentially a double point. One is, we need it, but we need more than that. So in other words, we need scales, but it's not the only thing we need. We need it as an ingredient of a larger complex of theoretical notions and analytical concepts. And the second thing I want to emphasize, when we need it as an imaginative notion, a thing that helps us imagine social reality in a particular way, and in that sense is almost by necessity loosely descriptive. In that sense also, I would say that any attempt at rigorously defining it, and in a way objectifying or reifying it as an analytical concept, will not, say, get us very far. Okay, so that's the introduction, or at least the preliminary things that I wanted to say. Now here's my story of the use of the notion of scale, and it goes back to, let's say, 2004, 2005, when I was deeply involved in issues that had to do with voice and globalization. So voice and globalization were the two dimensions that I was trying to incorporate in a way. And for those of you who are familiar with a little bit of the work from that era, for instance, a book called Discourse, A Critical Introduction, this is basically the treatment of this issue, and it revolves around basically two elements. One is the issue of resources, and the second one is the issue of mobility. The issue of resources goes back in many ways to Heimsian sociolinguistics. The issue of mobility was a thing that I brought to it, in the sense that, my feeling was that sociolinguistics at the time needed that dimension. Now, the issue of resources is very important for what follows, because one of the things that I had encountered, notably in work around, or at least on the basis of African asylum seekers' narratives, also doing a little bit of expertise for immigration courts and so on, was that a number of resources, or specific resources, function well in some places, but not in others. And in that sense, there were resources, that appear to offer more mobility, mobile voice, if you wish, than others. Concretely, an African language in Europe has less voice potential, let's say, than in Africa, for obvious reasons. while English, of course, has a larger voice potential in Africa as well as here in Europe. So you see a distinction between how resources basically enable things at a level of circulation, level of scope. The way I formulated it, not yet at that moment, but afterwards, was, that, so if we now rephrase it a little bit, we could see that there were a number of resources, or specific resources, that had scale affordances. They would enable people to move from one scale to another, while other resources would basically lock people in particular scale levels and never leave them out in a way. Okay. And so here, of course, we see basically how these two dimensions of ambivalence that I mentioned earlier, scope and value, they coincide. They coincide in a sort of Bourdieuian idea of legitimate language. Legitimate language is very often legitimate language in a place, but you would see that specific linguistic resources would enable you to be legitimate in more places than in others. Okay, so this was a first sort of insight that I tried to articulate in that book in discourse. But while doing it, of course, many problems emerged, but three really big ones. Because it's a sociolinguistic insight, it's a sociolinguistic item, so the idea of resources and mobility and the scale affordances of particular resources is a sociolinguistic issue that raises three others, three really significant ones. The first one is the issue of meaning. So what sort of stuff goes into meaning making in reality, and how do we need to theorize that or approach that in analysis? The second problem is that of situatedness, a very important analytical notion in the sort of work that we do in sociolinguistic discourse analysis and so on. So the entire idea of context, if you wish. And the third big issue, big problem, is the problem of indexicality. So three problems: meaning, situatedness, and indexicality. Indexicality, of course, follows from the two previous ones in the sense that indexicality is basically text-context relationships. So if we complicate the first, let's say, two, then evidently indexicality will fall victim to that as well. So let me now try to give you an overview of how I address these three issues, and I have to start with the problem of meaning. And of course that was absolutely central in the discourse book, in the 205 book, and here I think, so in that book and in this context of the problem of meaning, the notion of scale essentially indicated the non-unified nature of meaning. So the fact that meaning is not a unified thing, but has to be basically truncated and also chopped up or layered into several very, very different aspects that go into it. Okay. So the central notion in that book was the fact that meaning is layered, or at least the insight that meaning is layered, is made up of a number of layers, and these layers I imagined as historically loaded elements of meaning. So historically loaded elements of meaning. So you had basically all sorts of different historicities that interact within a moment of articulation. And that moment of articulation, of interaction, for instance, with somebody, is a moment of what I call synchronization in interaction. So whenever we perform interaction, we synchronize a thing which essentially is a layered cake of different forms of historically loaded elements or resources, if you wish. So whenever we communicate, here's the thesis from the book, we deploy a variety of intertextual resources. A variety of intertextual resources that have to do with the topic, for instance, but also the interlocutors, the language, the accent, the register, the technology, the knowledge, and so on that goes into it. So all of these elements are being brought into this moment of interaction, okay? But these elements, of course, have very, very different historicities and also a number of other features that I will discuss in a moment. Now, while all of these elements are always deployed synchronically, okay, we have to realize that they are not equivalent, right? They are, and here's an important notion, they are of a different order, And that order, or at least this idea that things are of a different order, is a way of saying they operate at all sorts of different scale levels. For instance, English, okay, is of a higher order than the specific interlocutor, in the sense that you can use English with numerous interlocutors. And so the way in which you use English in that sense is a higher order influence on what happens than the choice of a particular interlocutor with whom you engage at the moment of interaction. Now these differences, these different orders, so the fact that all these elements are of a different order, create of course different effects. Concretely, when you change a higher order element, then the effects will be more numerous or more general than if you change a lower level, a lower scale sort of element in a moment of meaning making. Concretely, if we go back to our example of English, shifting from English to Swahili, for instance, will exclude more interlocutors than when you simply change an interlocutor while you're speaking English. And so a change at a higher order level, okay, will affect more things, will have a more profound effect on what happens than a change at the lowest level of let's say, lowest level of scale in interaction. And so the scope and valuation again are basically one here. So this ambivalence of the notion of scale here again is merged into one insight, and as the insight of highly differential effects that emerge from changes at a number of different scale levels. Higher order changes will affect more than lower order ones. The value of resources very often depends on the scope of validity of them. So of the level of distribution, of understandability, of deployment in a number of specific situations. And here, of course, I had all sorts of elements, analytical elements that I drew from work again on African asylum seekers, okay, whose linguistic resources, for instance, accented English or forms of French or whatever, let alone African languages, were heavily devalued because they had hardly any scope of transaction, so to speak, in the environments in which they had to be produced. They were very lowly ranked because they were very often misunderstood as well. So here again, you see how scale, basically the clumsiness of the notion is also in a way its productiveness. So it enables you to imagine the junction between scope, a horizontal sort of distributional idea, and value, a vertical one that has to do with quality, with value attribution, valuation, and so on and so on. Now, all of this I try to document in another book, which is called Grassroots Literacy, which is exactly about, how do resources like handwriting in African languages that operate locally in an eminently adequate way, how, at least what happens to them when they become mobile, when they're brought to other places where those particular resources have significantly less value, right? And here we see, the difficulties with globalization is that exactly due to these processes of scope and value attribution that intersect, we see new forms of inequality or old forms of inequality being reproduced. So here's the first problem, the problem of meaning. Scale for me came in as a way of imagining the non-unified nature of meaning, the fact that whenever we produce meaning, we produce a sort of layered system of historical influences, historical elements that enter into the meaning making, and we need to imagine them as being of a different order. And that brings me to the second problem, the problem of situatedness, or if you wish, the problem of context. And here scale, very much in the same way as in the first example, scale enabled me to imagine the non-unified nature of context. So the fact that context is not one thing, but again is a sort of layered whole in which the different layers again represent very, very different forms of influence, and as a consequence also generate loads and loads of very different effects. Now remember Sikura, or at least I'm not the first to to make that observation. Indeed, I just followed the work of others, and of course the most eloquent or the most influential one in this field has been Sikkerel, who emphasized already in the late 60s and early 70s, the layered, the stacked nature of context as a source of inference. All right. So whenever we communicate, we make inferences from the context, but the context, of course, is highly different depending on, let's say, your social position. For instance, the context of the patient and of the doctor in the medical encounter is fundamentally different, even if these two contexts, intersect in the moment of interaction. And it was, of course, Sikkerel as well, who emphasized that access to contexts can be severely limited. There are people who have access to specific sort of context, for instance, the doctor, right? And others don't. And again, he emphasized that this is a form of inequality, and a real form of inequality, something we very often overlook as well in analysis and so on. In analysis, in our field, the field of discourse analysis or sociolinguistic discourse analysis, we or at least a lot of that collapses in this notion that we very often use, the notion of the local in analysis. So local conditions for production, the local influences of certain elements from a context, on what goes on in the interaction. Now, what is the local? If you look at the way in which it is very often used, well, then the local is a sort of synchronized here and now that operates as a self-contained and in many ways self-sufficient reservoir of inferential meaning. So we don't need anything else. If we look at the local conditions for production, we have enough there to explain all the inferential work that goes on in an interaction that we are analyzing. And a good example of that, I would say, is traditional CA, conversation analysis. So if you look at what is accepted there as inferenceable context, that's the local, right? It's a very, very narrow sort of idea of context. Evidently, in my case, trying to address globalization forces us perpetually, to realize that the local is infused with non-local, translocal influences. And of course, these translocal influences now include truly global influences that are, of course, each time locally enacted. Okay, but even the enactment is strongly dependent on the translocal elements that went into that reenactment or that unique enactment. So in my case, the problem that I identified for myself was the problem of multiple contexts, one layer of which we could call the unique situatedness of a moment of interaction. So indeed, the here and now, the contingent, brought about sort of local context of interaction that is a reservoir for inferences. But then again, never alone, we also see stuff that is generically inferenceable. So in other words, stuff that is not purely local in its nature, but has been brought into that local moment of articulation as a reservoir, but not as a latent one, not as an inactive one, but as an agentive one. I mean, it imposes its rules and it has its effect and so on and so on what goes on. And I think simply again of a doctor-patient interaction, you will always see more or less the same structure. Now, while everything, of course, is locally enacted and also unique in that sense. So each instance of a doctor-patient interaction will be strictly and absolutely unique, while it will be very similar to the previous one and also to the next one. So here's local infused by translocal context, if you wish. Okay, the unique situatedness versus or with the non-unique one, the generic situatedness of things, and jointly, they construct meaning. They jointly, not in themselves, but jointly operate as a reservoir of inferences. In other words, of meaning making and interpretation. Now here's the next step. So we see these different contexts, and we see how you have these contextual influences that we call local or unique on the one hand, and translocal or generic on the other hand. But we need to understand that the layering of contexts, of course, what is the context for inferencing, all right, equals the layering of norms. A very important notion here, norms. So when we make these contextual inferences, we usually don't make them in a random way or in a chaotic way. We make them on the basis of norms, normative understandings of what is a self-evident inference in a particular environment, a particular moment of articulation. So we use norms. Okay. And so here was a thing that I began to realize, that in every communicative event in which we find ourselves, we address multiple normative systems at the same moment. So not just one set of norms, like, you know, the locally evolving one, the way in which I as an individual talk with this individual doctor, but also non-local ones, and maybe even global ones, and so on and so on, that also have to be satisfied in order to be adequate in communication. I call this notion polycentricity. So any social environment in which we find ourselves is polycentric, in the sense that multiple norms will be available, okay, and we need to satisfy, or at least we address all of them, even if we orient to one or two or a number of specific ones amongst them. So they will always be there, okay, and it's just the local work we do that makes all sorts of distinctions between which specific normative system will be addressed, will be activated, and so on. But the others are never absent. Okay, so the notion of the polycentric social environment as an environment for communication became an important notion there in trying to address this issue of situatedness. So when we think about situatedness, it is a polycentric situatedness. Scales, where are scales in this? It's exactly the same thing as before. The different sets of norms that we find in a communicative situation are again not equivalent, but they are very often of a different order. Again, referring to doctor-patient interaction, there is the sort of unique inter-individual set of norms that is being activated, okay? Also the norms of one specific unique individual with a sort of a condition that needs to be addressed in a different way from the previous or the next patient, all right? But then also there are the institutional norms that need to be satisfied. For instance, the role-taking pattern and the way in which one person speaks and the other one speaks has to be different. And the same with the lecture, is the same, you know, when we buy a train ticket and what have you. Eh? So we see again that these multiple norms are not equivalent, they are stratified, right? They are stratified, and there will be norms that operate on a higher level, on a higher scale level than others. For instance, the institutional scale level normally is the recurrent one. So in the sense that even if the conversation that a particular doctor has with a particular patient would be unique, we would see the generic elements, the institutional elements, the institutional norms recur and reiterate themselves over and over again, because that is what these higher order contexts basically do. So scale again here enters into the picture as a way of imagining the specific way in which situatedness is non-unified. It is not just unified in the sense of multiplicity. You have multiple contexts, you know, that are available. No, there is also sort of hierarchical ranking in terms of influence and effect. And that brings me to the third problem that I wanted to address, the problem of indexicality. Now here, once again, the effect of scale, or the way in which, you know, scale was productive for me, is to imagine the non-unified notion of indexicality. And of course, given the two previous points, this one is easy and straightforward. But again, you know, we have to translate a little bit. So we've already seen the polycentric situation, okay, the layered system of meaning making and so on. But in this polycentric situation, we now know that various differently scoped and valued orders of indexicality will be present, right? Orders of indexicality. They will be present at the same moment. Now, what are, or at least how are they present, these orders of indexicality? They basically function as emic regulators of meaning. Emic regulators of meaning. And I mean by that, they are not just an analytical notion, an external notion that is imposed by us, but very often the participants in an interaction appear to have a very clear language ideological understanding of the norms and the scope and the value of particular forms of expression in relation to these norms. Yeah, so in that sense, it's an emic regulator of meaning making in these polycentric environments. Little footnote here, I use the term orders of indexicality, and I know there's another term available, which is indexical order. There are people who use them as equivalents. In my view, they're not. Indexical orders, in the sense as, for instance, Aga and Michael Silverstein use them, are, in my view, locally enacted batteries, sets of meaningful signs, locally enacted. So in other words, it's a locally enacted pragmatics and metapragmatics. For me, that's the meaning of indexical order. Now, order of indexicality, for those of you who are familiar with the work of Foucault, you hear the older notion of orders of discourse there. And it is truly something that goes back to Foucault's work, in the sense that when I started using that notion, I used it very, very strongly in that Foucauldian sense as that which is normal, or at least perceived to be normal, the general forms of normalcy in social interaction. Okay, and of course then orders of indexicality would be a higher order notion than indexical orders, in the sense that many indexical orders would be absorbed in one order of indexicality. So my view here was, if we want to understand the precise nature of these polycentric environments, we need to see them as basically containing multiple and stratified orders of indexicality that are simultaneously present. Okay. Now, when we say that, or at least let me say a few things more on this notion of emic regulation of meaning making. It's maybe a little bit a cryptic notion here, so let me try to unpack it a little bit. What I mean by that is that meaning attribution basically proceeds on the basis of recognizability. We are in an interaction with somebody, and so we observe and we participate in interactional behavior. Okay. Now, specific elements of behavior, for instance, the way in which we perform in interaction, we pronounce certain things, or we move our bodies in certain ways, or we use a particular language or register or variety, or whatever, okay, would be understood as recognizable as X, Y, Z. A particular thing, like a joke or a lecture or a medical encounter. All right, but also, the one who produces it would also be recognizable as a doctor, a lecturer, a serious individual, a joker, etc., etc. And so we have this particular sort of idea that a number of organized signs basically project recognizability as a particular thing, a particular social encounter. Okay. And so here, and in a way, this goes back to some of the previous remarks, but also anticipates a number of the later ones. The notion of genre, of course, becomes very, very important. Genre as a sort of non-stop balance between things that enable this recognizability, so are already there, are already known, and are a reservoir resources, that we can draw upon in order to produce recognizable meaning on the one hand, while having to make this realization unique over and over and over again. So things are recognizable as a lecture, but it's the individual performance of that genre that makes it into a nice lecture, an interesting lecture, or a boring one, or an uninformative one, and so on and so on. And it's the same with the lecturer. He or she might be seen as boring, as incompetent, or as very smart and very nice, and so on and so on. And so that recognizability brings us to the level of genre. And genre, again, what you see in genre, of course, is again this non-unified nature of communication, with new and rapid stuff on the one hand, and older, established, already there stuff, on the other. And of course, the latter is of a higher order, a higher scale level than the former. So I've now dealt with these three issues: the issue of meaning, the issue of situatedness, and the issue of indexicality. And for those of you who are familiar with another book of mine, the Sociolinguistics of Globalization, the three notions that I have tried to develop here now, so this idea of scale, polycentricity, and orders of indexicality, those are the three elements that I used as the central sort of notional or conceptual architecture of that exercise of a sociolinguistics of globalization. So what we see here is that scale is each time a crucial notion, an important notion, always pointing to the non-unified nature of what we are looking at. In other words, of sociolinguistic reality. Non-unified in the sense of there is a local, there's a translocal, there is the given or the known, and there is the new and the unknown, right? Like the creative, the innovative, and so on and so on. We have stability, we have dynamics, we have change, and what have you. So all of that is always there. And if we want to do justice to exactly that sort of, let's say, ontology, all right, then we need the notion of scale as a way of imagining that. At the same time, and I've already said it, this non-unified nature of sociolinguistic reality demands also more precise notions, more precise concepts, than simply scale, in the sense that scale makes a number of things imaginable, but at the same time is a relatively rough or, say, clumsy instrument for doing more than just that. So it stimulates the imagination, but that's basically where it stops. So bottom line, we need scales, but with scales alone, we won't get far. So we need more than scales in order to do the analysis. Now, what has happened after the sociolinguistics of globalization? So let me just give a very quick run through of a number of other elements that in the meantime have influenced my handling of the notion of scale. Okay. The first element, of course, is the notion of complexity. We have moved, I think, from a sociolinguistics of mobility to a sociolinguistics of complexity. And in that move, the idea of scales as an element of the imagination of social reality has become entirely absorbed. So in other words, scale, or the scaled nature of sociolinguistic reality, is now a simple elementary feature of the object of investigation, of any sociolinguistic object. Okay, and it is one of the features of it. So we now know, or at least, if we now have to define sociolinguistic objects, we will always say that they're non-unified and polycentric. So here's the notion of scale, of course. They are also sensitive to a variety of different forces, i.e. norms, okay? Not just one set, but a range of them. They're never purely local, they're never purely stable, they're never purely individual. Yeah, so there would always be more than that, and then finally they're always, dynamic and unfinished. We're never looking at an entirely finished sort of object. It's always on the move, in development, towards a new form of reality. So here what we see, in my view, is that scale has basically become an element of the way we imagine social facts. Okay, so whenever we look at social facts now, we already, in simply describing them, assume that they are scaled. Scale is an absolutely intrinsic, let's say, element, even a defining characteristic of social reality. And for those of you who are familiar with our work on superdiversity, you know that this is an absolutely central element of the way in which we speak about sociolinguistic reality there, but it can be expanded towards a larger sort of specter of objects, and so on and so on. Another thing we see, of course, is that scale, in the sense that I just specified, is also a really important element in a critique of synchronicity, right? And in that sense, a critique of structuralist linguistics, in which there is no context, of course, and in which you would have these this idea of stability and homogeneity, non-historicity of the linguistic object. The moment we introduce scale as a fundamental sort of element of sociolinguistic reality, that kind of structuralism is no longer, let's say, accurate or adequate or applicable. Okay. Brings me to the very final little element. Recently, of course, we started working on the offline-online nexus. In my view, that has deeply, deeply changed the sociolinguistic economies of societies all over the world. And in that sense, of course, it makes the three problems that I addressed and I announced earlier, so meaning, situatedness, and indexicality, it makes these three problems even more acute, right? In the sense that now, of course, we need to address all sorts of things, that have to do with scale jumps at the same moment. So the moment you do an interaction, for instance, on social media like Facebook, you are in a purely, a uniquely situated sort of thing, which is you versus one individual. At the same time, you're addressing an enormous collection of people who are, let's say, dispersed over time and space. So we're now looking at vastly more complicated notions of situatedness, of meaning making, and of indexicality than before. And in that sense, makes an this new development makes an imagination revolving around exactly the scalar notion or imagination of sociolinguistic reality more relevant, more acute than ever before. But again, so once again, never in itself. So that's my story of scales. It's unfinished. It will go on and on and on. But the bottom line is, by all means use it, but never use it alone, because you will get into all sorts of difficulties. Thank you very much.